Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Five for Breakfast. We're now in our 42nd episode of 2024. And before we kick off, I'd like to thank Wesco, the platinum sponsor of Five for Breakfast. So I'm excited to announce that NTI has now approved the initial BEAD proposals for 55 of the 56 states and territories. So we only have one state left to go. And, at our Fiber Connect conference back in July, only 17 states had been approved. And at that point, Alan Davidson had promised our audience that NTI will have all of the states and territories largely approved by the end of the summer. And we are thrilled that NTI has lived up to its word. And while Congress is still in recess, Senate Majority Leader Schumer has publicly stated that they'll be prioritizing spectrum authorization bill, which includes funding for ACP, will be a focus for the lame duck session. So we're excited about that for ACP. Last week, we held a regional Fiber Connect workshop in Calgary, Alberta, and I have to say it was absolutely amazing. I was especially impressed with Nate Glubish, the Minister of Technology and Innovation for Alberta. Nate was a venture capitalist, and he has an amazing grasp on technology and innovation. He explained to our audience the latest on artificial intelligence and what he expects to see in quantum technology in the next 3 years. His economic development plans for Alberta is to recruit AI hyperscalers to the region and take advantage of its cold climate for cooling, a scalable energy capacity, and vast water supply. Nate is a visionary and a tremendous asset for Canada. Our next Fiber Connect regional workshop will be in Albuquerque, New Mexico on November 7th, and we're going to be focused on tribal broadband there, so please join us for that. And then we'll be in the Keys on December 9th and 10th for our Premier member meeting. So if you're a Premier member, that will be an event you won't want to miss. And we've been really working hard to finalize our dates and cities for our regional Fiber Connect events in 2025. So stay tuned because we'll be announcing those cities in the next few weeks. That brings us to today's Five for Breakfast. Our guests today are Amanda Weinstein and Adam Dewbury from the Center for Rural Innovation, or affectionately known as CORI, to discuss their latest research study, Beyond Connectivity, the Role of Broadband in Rural Economic Growth and Resilience. Before I formally introduce today's guests, I'd like to introduce David Norris from our team, who's going to walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thank you very much, Gary, and thank you everybody for joining us today. We appreciate it. Before I go over a few logistics, we'd like to once again thank our platinum sponsor, Fiber for Breakfast, Wesco. Now, please keep in mind all participants are in listen-only mode today. To ask a question, please type it into the question box, which is located in the control panel on the upper right side of your screen. We will have a Q&A session with our panelists near the end of today's session. This presentation is also being recorded and will be available on FBA's website within 24 to 48 hours, and you can find that recording in the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. Finally, at the conclusion of today's presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a brief feedback survey. Please take a moment to do so. We appreciate your input. And with that, I will pass things back over to Gary to get us started. Gary?
Thanks, David, and good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the President and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week on Fiber for Breakfast, our guest was Andy Burke, the USDA's RUS administrator, who discussed the bipartisan infrastructure law's historic broadband investment. Andy shared with us how RUS has a long track record of investing in critical infrastructure. As a result, fiber has been the technology of choice as utilities want to do the job right the first time. So if you missed that, you can go to our website and watch the replay. Today on Fiber for Breakfast, our guests are Dr. Amanda Weinstein and Dr. Adam Dewbury from the Center of Rural Innovation, CORI, to discuss their latest research study, Beyond Connectivity, the Role of Broadband in Rural Economic Growth and Resilience. So Dr. Amanda Weinstein leads research and knowledge and evaluation team in providing a better understanding of the economic dynamics of rural America. She holds a PhD in Agriculture, Environmental, and Development Economics, MS in Operations Research, and she has published numerous articles in various peer-reviewed regional science and economic journals. Before earning her PhD, she was a commissioned officer in the United States Air Force. So Amanda, thank you for your service. So Dr. Adam Dewbury joined the research team at CORI, and he brings a strong background in rural issues, extensive experience in living and working in deeply rural areas like New York's Adirondack Park. As a cultural anthropologist with a PhD from Cornell, his work has focused on rural economic development, political economy, and intersections of nature, community, and capital. With a robust background in research methodologies, including ethnographic fieldwork and digital ethnography. I don't even know what all you're doing, Adam, but you're doing a bunch of stuff. And you're adept at exploring complex social and dynamics in rural areas. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amanda and Adam to walk us through their research.
Awesome. Gary and David, thanks for having us. I feel like there's a joke in here. An economist, anthropologist, and the Fiber Broadband members walk into a webinar. Well, we are so excited to be here, and we are even more excited about this report and to get the good news of this report out there. Next slide. So as Gary mentioned, we are at the Center on Rural Innovation, and our goal at the Center on Rural Innovation is to grow more innovative economic ecosystems in rural America. And our research and data team does this by helping to inform policymakers and equip stakeholders with actionable insights to actually do this work in rural communities. Next slide. So I wanted to give a little context behind this report and why the findings are so important. So we know at the Center on Rural Innovation that there has been a widening divide between rural and non-rural places, driven by the rise of the knowledge economy. And we have seen rural places experience job loss, wage stagnation, and with less access to economic opportunities, what we also see is population loss. We see declines in a lot of rural places as they've been left behind. Next slide, please. And one thing we wanted to know is, how did this happen? Right? So we have heard about a lot of larger global economic trends, and they have all disproportionately negatively impacted rural areas, from automation and globalization, which we've heard a lot about, but less about how it actually affects rural places, specifically rural places, and also the decline in entrepreneurship we've seen across the US. Next slide, please. So when we look at what's going on in rural places, when we break up into these three large sectors, the tradable goods sectors, predominantly manufacturing, local services, and tradable services, on the left, you see what it looks like in rural America. On the right, you see what it looks like in non-rural America. And we can see that rural America is more reliant on the tradable goods sector or manufacturing. So that means things like globalization and especially automation are going to be disproportionately affecting rural areas. And that's exactly what we see in the research. We see that this reliance on manufacturing has led to lower growth in rural areas. Next slide, please. But the bigger problem is that blue line you see at the bottom there. That looks very different. So what you're looking at with that bluish teal line is the knowledge economy or tradable services. And we see that rural areas especially have not benefited from the rise of the knowledge economy. They haven't seen as many businesses and startups happen in this sector when we compare rural places to non-rural places. And we think this is the bigger problem in rural here, is really that they have been left behind by the knowledge economy and the tech sector. Next slide, please. So when you think about the knowledge economy, the tradable services economy, it requires broadband. And I was going to put this as the title. And then I was thinking like, well, really, it's the economy in general. Our economy in the US now requires broadband. And when we look just 10 years ago, there was a 30 percentage point gap in broadband access between rural and non-rural places. This is a very large gap. But we've seen a lot of advances. We have seen and increasingly rural places have access to broadband. So now that gap is less than 10 percentage points. And what this means is this is a big change, right? And we don't fully understand what the impact is going to be, what the impact has been, and what it's going to be in the future. But what we wanted to do with the study is figure out what that impact is. Next slide, please. So when we look at the third biggest one, I don't think we've talked about as much in this country, and that's the decline in entrepreneurship. right? We have a lot less entrepreneurship, a lot less startups, a lot fewer small businesses starting in this country. And this is true across America, but it is also especially true in non-metro or rural areas. And we know that this is a concern across America, but it is especially a concern in rural America. So I have one of my friends and colleagues actually have said that among the best shot for rural areas to help close that gap between rural and non-rural places is to focus on small business, entrepreneurship, startups, however we can to help foster that innovation that has really been the backbone of the American economy for so long, but has been declining for decades. And this is something that I know as economists, we have been quite concerned about for decades, is what is going on with entrepreneurship and startups in this country. Next slide, please. So when we looked at this study, what we wanted to look at is what is that impact? What is the impact of giving rural areas access to broadband? But going further, what we want to look at is what is that impact of actually leveraging that broadband? So we wanted to look at, for example, broadband adoption rates. So the graph you're seeing there is a relationship between broadband adoption rates in rural places and establishment entry or the growth of new businesses. So when you see that sloping line, what we see is the higher broadband adoption rates you see, the more people are actually using that broadband, the more businesses you see starting up in rural places. Now, how do we get more of the broadband adoption rates? How do we get our communities and our residents and our businesses to actually leverage broadband? So we do it in two ways. So one is fiber. Typically, the way that we get adoption rates above 80% adoption rates in rural places is through fiber, is by having high speed, high quality, gold standard for broadband fiber in rural places. The next is value added broadband services. So what we found is a lot of rural co-ops and small internet service providers are the companies that are more closely tied to their communities, and they're more likely to, one, make that upfront investment in fiber because they're thinking about it as a long run investment, and also provide value added broadband services that are kind of uniquely tied to their local community. Next slide, please. So what we did in this study is we looked at kind of three categories. We have high broadband utilization, low broadband utilization, and kind of neither. And the goal is not a Goldilocks thing here. Your goal is not for kind of the in-between, at least not according to this data. What you want to be in is that high broadband utilization. What we found is for those communities, they're in that high broadband utilization, they actually saw growth in the number of businesses, where every other category saw declines. So here we define high broadband utilization as if you're actually able to get broadband adoption rates greater than 80%. And we also looked at that small internet service provider coverage to see where are those providers providing that value added broadband services and helping their communities leverage broadband to benefit their communities. That low broadband utilization we defined as broadband adoption rates less than 70% and about the national average for coverage. Next slide, please. So what we found here was really quite shocking, I think. When you compare rural communities with this high broadband utilization to similar communities that just don't happen to have this high broadband utilization, what we find is a very different economic path. We find that they are more likely to increase the number of businesses, where similar rural communities that don't have high broadband utilization, they actually see declines in the number of businesses. They see businesses closing, going out of business, where the high broadband utilization, not only are they keeping the businesses they have, but they are growing new businesses. And the difference in those two growth paths is a 213% difference in the growth rate. Going from declining businesses to increasing the number of businesses, that's a 213% difference in the growth rate of businesses for those communities. Next slide, please. So what this means for these communities is that they're also just growing their economy. By keeping businesses and growing businesses, we see that those high broadband utilization communities have a 44% higher GDP growth rate. Next slide, please. This also leads to more income for residents. So we know that entrepreneurship is a way for rural residents to generate wealth, not only wealth for themselves as the owners of these businesses, but also wealth for their communities as they grow their economies. For communities in that high broadband utilization, they saw per capita income growth rates that amount to 18% higher, which amounts to about $500 more per person every year for communities in those high broadband utilization communities. Next slide, please. So what does this mean? We found, I think, tremendous results here showing that we have more businesses and it is helping to put communities on a completely different growth path for their economies. But we wanted to dive deep into what that actually meant for real communities. And to do that, we did 3 case studies. We're going to dive deep into one case study and give you a little sneak peek at the next. So to do that, I'm going to actually pass it off to Adam, who led our case studies for this study.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, so the first one we'll look at is Beltrami County in Minnesota. It's in northern Minnesota. It's a relatively small county at about 46,000 people. And the county seat is the city of Bemidji, which has about 15,000 people. And what's really been a driver here in this county and city is a small cooperative ISP, Paul Bunyan Communications. And these little ISPs play critical roles in driving adoption and access. And a big part of the reason why is because they operate under a different model, mindset, whatever you want to call it, than like a large publicly traded ISP. These cooperatives are really focused on doing what's right for their communities. And that's something we've heard over and over again. So Paul Bunyan started building their fiber network in 2004, really forward thinking about what would be the best value for their community that would last a long time. And this filters into everything they do. They offer free public Wi-Fi throughout the city, which is fantastic. They rolled out their gigabit service in 2014, really doing great things and really active in the community. Next slide, please. So this just shows the correlation between that high broadband utilization rate and percent change in businesses, so growth in business establishments. Next slide. And this just gives you a few numbers: 120 new businesses between 2010 and 2021, and 25 just in 1 year between 2020 and 2021. Next slide, please. And it's not just about adding new businesses. Having this robust fiber broadband can also help existing businesses to grow and to expand, like we've seen here with Aircore Aviation. Next slide, please. So again, this doesn't just happen by having broadband. It happens because cooperative ISPs do an awful lot of stuff. They engage in collaborations like with the Beltrami Electric Co-op to create the Bemidji Technology Park. Paul Bunyan has collaborated with Greater Bemidji, which is a local economic development org, to develop the Launchpad, which offers a full suite of support services for entrepreneurs, mentorship, connection with capital, meeting space, training. Next slide, please. They also in 2016 started the Gigazone Gaming competition, which brought 4,000 people to this little city for an esports competition. And they further expanded on that by adding a tech expo where they have all kinds of businesses involved in tech come to this to get career path opportunities in front of, these mostly young people who are participating in the gaming competition. And they also launched the North Startup Pinch competition for entrepreneurs here at the Tech Expo. Next slide, please. And you can see Hemo Research is a tech company based in Bemidji. They were a finalist in the North Startup competition and a prize winner. And their whole business model is focused on developing hardware modules that will help other entrepreneurs develop electronic products. Next slide, please. And then our next case study, which we're going to release soon, is Bullock County, Georgia, which also small cooperative ISP, Bullock Solutions, They've got a 3,000-mile fiber network, super ubiquitous access throughout the county, very high rates of utilization, and they're also doing great, on some of the metrics that we've talked about here. So look for that. It's a real interesting story about people coming together to do good stuff for their community.
All right. Well, Adam, Amanda, this is really interesting stuff. Let's start with, can you talk a little bit about um, what any surprises you saw in the study? Because I mean, you kind of went into this knowing that, you know, faster broadband, higher adoption is good, but what are the kind of the big surprises you saw?
I mean, I think for me, some of the surprises are we're seeing what was going on in real communities. When we started to look at the communities where broadband was just having an outsized impact, we saw this commonality of this really a community mindset, that this wasn't just business as usual. This was, how do we engage our community in small ways, from having even an ice cream truck for kids sponsored by the local ISP to having broadband throughout their downtown. But it was really seeing this commonality of mindset, and it was different in every town. The things that the broadband service providers were doing were different and unique to that town, and that has been something that I think was really, I don't know if surprising is the right word, but also just refreshing, just to see how connected they were to their communities and the wide variety of things they were doing to engage the community, that was really all boosting broadband adoption rates. And even things like esports, I think, can really be underestimated, where like, oh, they're playing video games and it's kind of nice. But what you don't realize is when you're engaging with young people, broadband adoption rates actually go up in those communities, right? And it's not because the kids are paying out of their allowance. It's because they are exposing their parents to all of the different things that broadband can do. And it just exposes the community what broadband can act, how it can actually impact their lives.
Well, hey, David, can you put that slide back up and go back to Bemidji, the plot there, the graph? So there's a lot of questions about, maybe Adam, you can explain the graph and the dots on that graph.
Yeah, so I can actually talk about that. So this is looking at for every single rural county across the country. It's plotting their adoption rates and the percent growth in businesses. And what we saw, which is one of the reasons why we went to Bemidji, is that they are an outlier. So the fact that they're above that line means that they are actually having an outsized impact. And when we started to look at these different communities, they're kind of up there with Bemidji. We saw they are providing fiber. They are trying to provide ubiquitous fiber where everyone has access, which is not common throughout the US, let alone for rural places. So where everyone in these rural places has access to fiber broadband. And then we also saw these value-added broadband services. They are connected with their local chamber, their local economic development organizations, their schools, to just do more to engage the community in their business and their business model.
We also have an interesting question here. So what do you think the main drivers towards expanding broadband access to rural communities, and what are the main bottlenecks?
Oh, to me, it's time horizon. I think for a lot of, I think politicians and even some businesses, we have maybe a 3-year time horizon. The problem is for communities, they're not looking at a 3-year time horizon. They're looking to make their community a place where their kids stay and work and build a life, or come back to build a life, right? That's not a 3-year time horizon. That's a 10, 20, 30-year time horizon. And I think the difference in those time horizons are really kind of, to me, where fiber comes in. When you're looking at fiber and the benefits of those communities, we're thinking about what's a 10, 20-year benefit for that community, right? So, but when you have a politician say, well, what's the benefit we get in a couple of years? You might say, well, it's not fiber, it's too expensive, right? We're not willing to make that upfront cost. But I think when you look at a longer time horizon and when you talk to community members and what they want for their community, they want that long-term benefit that's going to benefit not only them, but their kids. So their kids can build a life in those communities. And I think it's really that time horizon.
You know, The Economist had a really interesting article, the kind of the anatomy of a dying town. And what they said is that in the U.S., nearly half our taxes are from state and local revenue sources. And so when you start losing population, then you start to lose tax revenue, and then you get in a death spiral where people aren't able to keep up government services and trash pickup and keep up the houses and so forth. And so you basically go in this whole death spiral, where what they show is then as you have communities that are focused on economic development, and I know Amanda and Adam, it seems to me the number one driver of economic development is availability of high-speed broadband. Is that what you say that's true?
Absolutely. So what we saw that I didn't talk about as much is on the low side. So if you're in the low broadband utilization, what we found there is you not only lose businesses and you have lower GDP growth, lower income growth, you lose population. So if you're not doing this, you will get in that spiral that you talked about. You will lose people as they don't have access to economic opportunity. What we found on average for the high broadband utilization is it actually broadband itself didn't have a statistically significant impact on population, which meant populations were able to hold steady. You don't lose people, but people are able to stay. What that also means is the biggest benefits of broadband are going to existing residents. So for the average rural community, this isn't a benefit that somebody somewhere gets off moving in. It's for the residents that are there right now. And it's to stop that outflow of people, where if you look at surveys of rural residents, they say that they need to move to access economic opportunity. Not that they want to move, that is the only way they think that they can access economic opportunity. But what broadband does is it opens up a lot more economic opportunity, not just remote work, but what we show here is also through entrepreneurship and businesses. Businesses increasingly need access to that broadband, not just to access customers from across the country, but also even just for their, back end operations. You increasingly need broadband for almost every aspect of business and work today.
So another question that came in is, who can provide the most effective leadership in helping rural communities to realize the economic benefits of broadband?
Oh, I mean, I feel like this is the answer that economists give the most often that people hate is it depends. But I think it depends. What we see is, right, if you've seen one rural community, you've seen one rural community. And I think that kind of drives home with this. What we saw in a lot of our case studies is it was the broadband service provider. They were the leaders on showing the community how important broadband was, how it can integrate into almost every aspect of the community, how important it is for the economy, and how important it is for those partnerships. They're not going it alone, but they're the leaders in building up those partners across the community. But in some places, it's the K-12 schools. It's teachers saying, I want my kids to have access to the same type of technology that every other kid across this country or in these urban places has. So in some places, it's the teachers or it's the schools. In other places, it's the chamber, it's economic development, it's their, small downtown saying, I want my businesses to have this. In other places, it might be higher ed, the university actually helping people with access. In other places, it's nonprofits who just say, I am concerned about my community. I'm trying to do what I can. We've seen in East Texas, there's a nonprofit who really is looking at broader models of economic development and really being a leader here. So it kind of depends of who's going to spearhead it in these communities and who's going to be the champion and build those partnerships.
So if I just wanted to net out the key takeaway, and correct me, but what I think I heard you say is it's not about having minimum connectivity. It's that you need to have fiber so that you can have at least 80% take rates to really move the needle. Because if you do this halfway, it's pretty binary. Either you're growing or you're not. And if you don't have this high adoption with high quality broadband, so throwing up a LEO satellite or doing something with unreliable broadband is not going to do the trick. You have to get the adoption there.
That's exactly right. For people to adopt it, it needs to be a good product, right? And fiber is really the good product that rural places need to get those adoption rates above 80%.
Well, Amanda and Adam, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you guys sharing your research and your insights, and I really appreciate all the work you're doing to keep rural America connected and moving forward, the backbone of our nation. And so I hope everybody can join us again next Wednesday. We're going to get together with Ryan Kudra from Finley Engineering, who's going to discuss best practices with 4 steps to successfully navigate complex permitting processes. So you're not going to want to miss that. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you guys next Wednesday.
Thanks, Gary.
Thanks, Gary.